So, I must admit, I've been a little bit apprehensive about this talk today, and then this is such a hard act to follow, not just Jake, but everybody. I mean, it's just been such a good conference, so I'm hoping I do this last slot justice, because yeah, it's been really great. So I'm going to start us off with a quote by Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he said that there's a theory that states that if ever anyone discovers exactly what the universe is for and why it's even here, it will instantly disappear and be replaced by something even more bizarre and inexplicable. And then there's another theory that says that this has actually already happened. And I really love this statement because every time I think about it, I kind of think of the web, right? It's bizarre, it's inexplicable. We don't really know why it's here, but it's amazing. And it keeps kind of morphing and shifting into different things. And I kind of think that one of the reasons that we're constantly debating whether the web maybe is or isn't dying or about to die is that maybe we're still not really quite sure how to use it to its full potential. And this isn't really our fault. I mean, for one thing, humans are actually pretty bad at predicting the potential of a technology. I mean, poor Tim Berners-Lee had horrible press like this when he first came out with, bits and pieces of the internet. People thought he was just completely insane. And if you go back and look at other things that we've invented, I mean, if this were 1910, we'd probably be sitting in a big room like this all talking about electric motors and how we would find a way to put one electric motor in every person's house, and they would have their wonderful, perfect little motor, and then they would attach it to other things, and they would carry it around the house and attach it to one thing, and then that thing would be motorized, and they would carry it and transfer it to something else. And that also still kind of makes me think about the web, because we still kind of talk about it sometimes like it's this thing that we've just kind of attached to a business or a product or a process, and it just kind of attaches itself and it's supposed to help somehow, rather than what it actually sometimes tends to do, which is just drive it and completely enhance it, and sometimes even totally replace it or disrupt it. So in this presentation, I'm going to explore a little bit about kind of the possibilities and the opportunities around the physical web. So whereas Scott covered the technology in quite a bit of detail yesterday, I won't discuss the technology for more than just a few minutes. I'm kind of going to talk about what might happen next, how it might impact the web, and how we see the web. Now, there might be a few people in the room, though, who didn't see Scott's presentation yesterday, so I will throw in little bits to kind of explain the context around it. So for anyone who wasn't here, so the physical web is an initiative to create what will be hopefully an open standard, and the goal is to extend the web that we have today, so the virtual web, into the physical world. And the project was started by Google. Matter of fact, it was pretty much started by Scott. But the idea is that this will be open, and there's already people like Mozilla and Opera looking to implement bits and pieces of it, and ideally it will become a part of the web. So it's not really a Google thing, it's an everyone thing is the ideal. So I'm going to talk about the physical web from that perspective, but also in some ways, to consider what the web is for, what the browser's for, what is really all this stuff for, and what might it do next, because what they're for today and what they've been for recently, I mean, what if the web is still at that stage of that kind of a motor in every home? What if the uses and the behaviors and the things that'll really define the web are actually just around the corner and we just haven't seen them yet? So just a couple slides, again, about the physical web, in case somebody here wasn't here yesterday. The general premise is that the number of smart devices is just going to explode, right? It won't just be that you might have a Nest thermostat in your house. There will be tons of objects that will be either very smart, kind of smart, partially smart. There will be smart things kind of everywhere, dotted around. And at the moment, if you want to interact with these things, you need an app. Matter of fact, you need the app that goes with this thing. And so you can instantly see the problem. If you have 100 of these things, you're not going to want 100 apps, and it just brings up all these problems in terms of, you want people to be able to just discover a thing and just kind of start using it, right? To just kind of serendipitously come across things and be able to do things with them without the download of the app and the friction that all that causes. So how is physical web working, right? So the technology is actually really, really simple. It's kind of just two things. There's a thing that wirelessly broadcasts a URL, so it's just throwing a URL out there. and then a piece of software, usually it would be on your phone, and it receives the URL in, and it displays it for you, and if you want to tap on it and go somewhere and have a look at what's at that URL, you do it yourself. That's basically the premise. It's completely, as a user, you're in full control. You decide when you want to look at it. If you don't want to look at it, it doesn't matter. It's like it's not there. And at the moment, the objects that are broadcasting these URLs are called beacons. This is one from a couple years ago, so it was about the size of my fist, but now they're about the size of a small coin. They usually have a small coin battery inside, so they can operate for a few years, and you just stick them on a wall, and they just broadcast the URL, and you kind of leave them alone. And they do this using Bluetooth. A little bit longer term, though, the idea is that this would be more of an ability, a capability that you would embed in all sorts of other things. So there might be things all around your house, all around the room, whatnot, that have this ability to broadcast a URL built in. And then you could do all sorts of stuff with it. And for all of this to work, we all need to have software on our device that can receive these URLs. At the moment, again, because it's really early, we just have some prototype software, and it's just built into Chrome on iOS, but it kind of pushes these URLs to the lock screen. Now, putting them on the lock screen is fine if there's 2 beacons, maybe 3, right? But again, if there's 100, you're going to need something a little bit more robust. So, enough of the description of the physical web, now we'll get into the rest. So, how might this browser-based discovery work, right? How could this go further than what we've got so far? Little bit of a disclaimer, we've got a whole bunch of concepts in this presentation, a whole bunch of ideas. Some of them, well, a lot of them feel quite plausible from a product perspective. I mean, I'm a UX designer, a product designer. A lot of these feel like they could be doable, and certainly from a UX perspective, they feel like they might be useful, but ultimately some of them probably they might not make sense, and certainly if you were a search engineer or an engineer of other kinds building other things, you might look at some of these and think, oh, you're crazy. But in some ways, that's the whole point, is just to put some ideas out there and start the conversation, because there's so many things that we're going to need and they're going to be useful. So let's start with the browser and search and kind of discovery, right? So ideally, at the beginning, there's probably going to be just a couple beacons around. So people won't know. They won't know they want to go to find a beacon. And so what would be nice is to kind of sneak them into the browser, because the browser is something that people use every day. Search is something that people use every day. And so first concept would be, in some ways the simplest thing you can possibly do is to sneak them into kind of the home screen experience that everybody comes to. And some browsers do this differently than others. Firefox on the left has a really nice series of tabs that already kind of pre-populates things, and you can just kind of swipe through the tabs and it brings things to you anyway. So putting it there would be a nice start, and I think actually that's what Opera ended up doing in their prototype, because they had a similar series of tabs. So people could just kind of notice it, poke around, say, hey, what's this, and try it out, and it would be really unobtrusive, and then as it grows, you would ideally turn it into something a little bit more. What would you call it? I think beacon is a little bit antiseptic and a little bit kind of, you have to know what it is. Nearby, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of up for debate. But I think something that helps people understand what this could be would be really good. Now, beyond this, though, I mean, a browser, people search, right? So ultimately, I think having some sort of search involved is something that people will probably seek out. And at the very least, I mean, again, thinking of the simplest way that it could work, not that this is seamless by any means, is that most browsers are already, or most search engines rather, they're already segmenting search. They'll have the web searches, and then they'll put images and maps and videos and different types of content types and things ways you might want to look. So here again, we could incorporate beacons there. And again, it would be fairly unobtrusive. I mean, if you don't want to go to that section, you don't have to. If the only thing around you is a beacon, maybe it would actually just bring you to that section to begin with. One of the challenges is, again, at the beginning, there might not be much around. As a matter of fact, sometimes even later, there might not be much around. And that's something that we're not really used to. I mean, for years now, when you search for something, you're overwhelmed with a million results. You never have one result. You never have 0 results. It just doesn't really tend to happen. So here, it would, because you could say, okay, I want an izakaya restaurant, and there is absolutely nothing that matches that around, right? So Here is, again, cases where as a search engine, I think you could proactively say, okay, well, maybe there's no izakaya, but there's a sushi restaurant. There's various ways that you could handle this. But at the same time, it would kind of help to onboard people and for people to understand what are the boundaries of this thing, what is it trying to do, and what kind of information can it provide. Now, these records that I'm showing here, where it's just got the title and a little bit of information, I mean, that's generally the type of information that's shown right now in the prototypes. But when you think about it a little bit further, I mean, search engines, again, they're full of metadata, right? They go out, they index things that are known, they make relationships between things that are known from different places. And again, search engineers might find this a horrifying thought, but it feels like you could enhance the records. It feels as if you could say, okay, well, fine, you found a beacon, and it says that there's a restaurant right here. What else do we know about the restaurant? Because as a search engine, you probably know a whole lot about the restaurant. You might know things about when people frequent it. You also probably know some things about the user, depending on the preferences and the things that the user's enabled. Maybe you could bring in some social graph stuff. Maybe you could bring in some temporal data or some knowledge graph data to kind of enhance the record and make it more useful. And even specifically, I mean, the McDonald's example here is kind of nice because lately Google has started showing, when restaurants and things are busy, so it gives you a little graph. And if you're standing right in front of the restaurant, on the one hand, you could say, yeah, but you can just look inside the window and see if it's busy. But you could also say that actually that information is really useful because maybe it's busy right now, but maybe historically, at 2 o'clock, everybody goes away. And so now that all of a sudden becomes even more useful information to know that, okay, you go for a walk, you go look at the museum, you come back, and then the restaurant will be empty. So I think there's still lots of useful things you could do, keeping in mind the idea of proximity and of time and knowing that the person accessed it at that point. And then you have productivity and personalization, which is kind of an interesting topic because right now we don't personalize much in the browser. All we really do is kind of bookmarks and little things like that. There's not really that much. But here the situation is a little bit different. You could see, for example, examples where people would want to favorite things. And the idea here would be that at the moment, if you search for beacons in this room, it'll show you the one that's closest to you first, and then it'll progressively show you others. And once it leaves the range that it can scan, then that's it. But you could favorite things and basically say, it would be a way of saying, even if this thing is further away, I want it at the top of the list, right? Because it's a thing that's meaningful to me. And conversely, you could mute things, and these don't have to be negative. Mute, in other things like Twitter, it has connotations of, I don't want to hear about this person, I want to mute them. But this could actually be a positive thing. Let's say that you work in a shop, and the shop has 50 beacons in it, and you're a staff person. You don't want to see the user-facing beacons because you don't really interact with them, but you maybe want to see the staff-facing beacons, and so you bump those up so that you see them more often. So there's all sorts of different ways we might want to interact with it. And again, I mean, the personalization thing is kind of weird because it feels a little bit high maintenance. It's like, what, I'm gonna have like all this management of my search experience. I'm gonna filter my search experience. I mean, it starts to feel like it's an awful lot of work. But there is a little bit of a difference in the sense that historically, when we search for something, we mostly want to find other people's stuff out there on the internet. We're never looking for the thing that's right next to us in the room because, you don't do that, right? So here, in some ways, it kind of switches the search engine around. It kind of makes it more kind of as a dashboard for things that are important to you, because you might be the person who's put the beacons in the room. You actually want to find them. You want to look at them. And you want to create results that are meaningful to you. And the little scenario I have here is kind of a silly one, but there's some alpacas, I think it's in Austria, that have beacons on them right now. So let's say that you're the farmer, and you've got alpacas and they all have beacons, right? So you just open your little search browser and you don't even really have to do anything because it can sense how many alpacas are there. So let's say it sees 6 of them, you have 7 of them, so you know that there's one missing. It is little utilities that you could do like that just from having the visibility of what's around you that you might not visibly be able to see, but the beacon can detect them. So all of a sudden the search experience kind of changes into a much more personal thing that you can control. So these examples, they've been very kind of traditional still in the sense that we're talking about a search engine, you have lists and you have visualizations, but what if the browser or the discovery service could be something entirely different, right? What if we're thinking about it too much like we used to think about it? So here's an example of a product. It has nothing to do with the physical web at the moment. It's a bunch of wearable devices for the Pokemon Go game. And the idea with the devices is that they have a little light, they have a couple sensors, and they also have a vibration built in. And so as you walk around in the real world, you encounter things that relate to the game, kind of virtual things that are kind of almost like geocache things. You bump into different areas, and it vibrates and it tells you that you're in one of those areas, and then you play some aspect of the game, right? So in some ways, this is a browser, right? It's a bespoke implementation of a browser for one context. And the physical web is an open technology. I mean, in theory, you could use it for anything. You could have beacons for single uses, and then you could have certain types of browsers for really specific uses that would do nothing but kind of help you with this one task. Another example that I think is kind of interesting, this is an artist by the name of Neil Harbison, and Neil was born without the ability to see color. So what he did, most people might not do this, but he's a bit of a hacker and he's an artist, and so he found a doctor and convinced the doctor to implant an antenna into his head. And the antenna has a sensor at the end, and the sensor converts color frequencies to sound. So basically he can hear color. And then again, because he's an artist, what he does is he goes to art museums and things, and he listens to paintings, and then he turns that around and he sometimes listens to things and then converts those back to color by making his own paintings. But again, to me, this is a browser, right? It's looking for a certain type of input, and then it's doing something with it. It's creating something completely different, a different way of seeing the world, basically. So you found some beacons, and then what next, right? What happens when you click? So there's 3 scenarios, and these are actually pretty similar to the ones that Scott went through, but again, I'm going to look at them from a slightly different point of view. So the first one is just pure discovery. So as Scott liked to call it, in some ways it's a much smarter QR code. That's all it does. It just helps you discover stuff, and then it gets out of the way. It's not involved after that. Nice way to think about it is this great quote from Adam Greenfield, who wrote one of the original books about IoT, and he said, the significance of technologies such as RFID and 2D barcodes, QR codes, and in a technology like this, right, is that they import physical objects into the data sphere. They endow them with an informational shadow. And that's what we're doing, is in some ways we're creating an information shadow that you can acquire, that you can find, and then we're making it meaningful and useful. So on the one hand, again, it is just an information shadow. It's just a URL, and you could type the URL, you could still use a QR code, you could do other things, right? So it feels at times kind of marginally useful and maybe even like an extra effort, but there is actually quite a bit more you can do. I mean, for one, there's the issue of distance. A lot of the other technologies, they were entirely proximity-based, certainly RFID and QR code. You need to be fairly close to do something with them. And yeah, that's why some of them are used for banking and so on, because you want that proximity. You want to be the only person there with that interaction. But with physical web, you can actually be quite far away. So all of a sudden, it opens that discovery to this entire room full of people, even if the discovery point, it doesn't have to be visible. It can just be out there. And then there's still the issue of knowing that somebody is nearby. I mean, there's been all sorts of people who've tried to augment content for all sorts of ways, but certainly knowing a user is nearby provides you with one opportunity to augment, and you can augment based on their location and also based on time of day, knowing that they are right there. Now, having said that, I'm about to contradict myself, and this is one of the things that I think is interesting, is that we don't quite know yet how people are going to use things. And certainly when mobile first started, one of the first things that happened is everyone automatically thought, okay, mobile is a different context. We will do totally different stuff on mobile. We will give people different content because they're on mobile. They won't need the other stuff. They're just going to be interested in doing little small things. And and then, of course, as it's turned out, it's not usually true. People want all the same stuff from the desktop. They just want it on their phone. And so you kind of have the same situation here, right? Because again, this is just a URL. Once the person finds this URL, they go to the web, they can do anything they want with what's on that page, right? And it's a URL, they can also bookmark it. So you could go to McDonald's, you acquire this URL, you're like, hey, I like this, you bookmark it. You go home, and then you use it at home. So what does that mean? So if you did all this wonderful proximal contextual stuff because you knew that they were at McDonald's, and then they go and they use the URL at home, is the content no longer meaningful? Did you optimize it too much for their context, right? It brings up all sorts of interesting questions. Will people want to do different things within a URL that they acquired nearby, but when they're not nearby? And that's something that the other, proximity-based things have never really had to deal with, because usually it was so app-focused. You couldn't take it home and then just use it because it was only something you could use there. Here, it's just a URL. Now, so the fact that you could provide the same functionality, so let's say you decide, okay, well, hold on, people will want to use the same functionality at home, so I'm not going to customize it at all. But it still brings up all sorts of other questions, right? So is that the same URL? Do you want to put a different URL in the beacon than the one you use at home? Do you use the same one? Do you customize it, right? And again, this is all stuff that we're going to have to experiment with. I mean, on the one hand, there's definitely benefit to mirroring the two things, right? So if you have a shop and you have a website, I mean, chances are, if you're a brand that has a physical and a virtual location, you're probably already mirroring those in some way. You're probably mirroring the architecture to a certain degree, so people know consistently what something's called, where to find it, what categories go with what. So you could very well use the same URLs, and just you can discover them in one place or you can discover them in another, and it brings you to the same content. On the other hand, you could look at it slightly differently, and you could say, okay, well, the internet is good at scale. It's good at searching through records and doing all that kind of stuff. But when somebody's in a physical location, you don't really want to expose that scale. You could be in a gallery and there's 100 objects, and you don't want a beacon on every single one of them. That would kind of kill the experience. So maybe you have one for the whole exhibit, and then maybe you have like this one object that's really important and you want people to focus in on it. Maybe you have a beacon for that. So there's good reason to kind of go both ways, and it'll be interesting to see how people use it. The other thing we haven't talked about yet is that a thing doesn't have to be a thing. A thing could very well be a person, right? You could slap a beacon onto your shoulder, put it on a little button or around your neck or something, and carry it around. And it could therefore exist only at a certain time or a certain place when that person is there, and then it just stops because the person isn't carrying it anymore. It stops being relevant because it's actually a moving beacon. So it doesn't have to be stationary at all. Now, to me, that kind of brings us back to discovery a little bit, because right now, once exploring the web gains this tangible form, it starts to feel a little bit magical. All of a sudden, it doesn't really feel like the old web anymore. It feels like it's maybe moved up a level into, I don't know. I mean, it makes you think of play. And so one of the interesting ideas that I ran into a while ago, and it harkens back to in the early days of the web, search engines, there was actual curation. And the reason there was curation is there wasn't much stuff online, so you could kind of pick and choose. Obviously, we can't do that anymore, but maybe there's still ways to bring curation back. And this is an example that I ran into a little while ago. It's a group that is doing research out in, I think, Los Angeles, was working with a couple companies. And they did a project on animism. Their idea was to bring kind of personality into objects that you could use as utilities. And so they created these little objects as prototypes. And each one is meant to help you when you're searching for stuff, when you need information. But rather than have them be, kind of, again, very functional utilitarian things, they're like little characters. So one is needy. He always wants attention. You have another one who's really nerdy. He's always going to give you numbers back as results, for example, because he's really kind of anal retentive, and he always wants to give you statistics. You have another one who might be really artistic. So he'll come up with completely different answers to something that you might be looking for. And again, this feels like a really interesting way that, I mean, again, up until now, searching on the web has been this really regimented thing. Almost feels like school. You're looking for something specific, you want a specific answer back. But, what if you want serendipity? What if you want to play? And it feels like out in the real world, you might sometimes want to do these things. So scenario number 2, so one, again, was just you fling the URL out, somebody acquires it, they can do something with it on the internet. That's it. That's the whole interaction. It's just really simple discovery. Scenario number 2 is you actually start interacting with things that are a little bit smart. And here I'm going to get geeky for just a second. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a kind of Internet of Things 101, because at the moment, anyways, and a lot of it has to do with current technologies. In the future, some of this is going to change. But at the moment, all these smart devices we have in our homes and things, smart light bulbs and so on, often we have an app and we use the app to kind of talk to the device, but actually in reality it's not talking to the device at all. In many cases it's doing this kind of round and round thing using the cloud kind of as a proxy. So just as an example, these are the Hue light bulbs. You've got your app, and you set your little light bulb, and you say, I want it to be blue. And so it goes up using Wi-Fi, up. Everything's always up in the cloud. And then it goes back down to this little round hub thing, which is in your house somewhere. It's plugged into a wall, and it communicates with Wi-Fi. So really, you're sending the command kind of to your house, to this thing that's a proxy. And then that thing actually communicates with the bulbs. And at the moment, the reason this is happening is because there's all sorts of different protocols, and it's actually hard to speak to the bulbs directly in a way that's going to work with the different protocols and keep it low power and all these various things. So the hub just goes back and forth to the bulbs, and those are different types of connectivity, different types of messages. And some of the bulbs even talk to other bulbs, and that way you can extend the message all the way through your house, even if you have one hub. So on the one hand, it's really complicated, but on the other hand, it's kind of simple. The idea is some things are smart, some things are only kind of smart, and so there's a lot of different ways to talk to them. At the moment, it's all happening with apps because there hasn't been a way to get the web involved here. But if you extended this pattern to the physical web, you could see how it could enable all sorts of really interesting, rich, but really casual scenarios. Again, the idea is for this kind of just-in-time, on-demand thing where you discover a thing and you're like, hey, this is not just a thing, it's a thing that can do a little bit of something. And all of a sudden you can interact with it. And maybe it's using the internet to do the round trip between your phone, and it talks to the net and then it talks to something else. In some ways, you don't really have to worry about that. All you know is all of a sudden this thing is actually kind of smart. And so there's a lot of things we can do really quickly with the physical web to kind of emulate that smarts and get people doing useful stuff really quick. So here's a bit of an example. And as you start looking at some of these examples, you can't help in some ways but kind of rethink what the word smart means, but also kind of what the word device means. So this is a coffee shop. Let's say it has a beacon, and it's broadcasting a URL. And so you open that URL, and you get this really simple app, and it says, right now we're playing this song. Do you want to vote for the next song? Really simple thing that anybody can do. You don't have to log in. You don't have to be invested in it at all. You just click, it shows you a bunch of songs, and you vote. And then at some point, somewhere in the cloud, there's a service that tabulates the votes and chooses the next song. Really simple. If you want a bit more interactivity, you could log in on your Spotify account, and then there maybe you could pick a song. You could kind of buy a song to play in the coffee shop. So what's the device in all of this, right? Is it the coffee shop? Is it the music player in the cloud? Is it the actual physical music player? I mean, in some ways, it doesn't really matter. You've added smarts to something that you never really considered could have smarts before, and you're using the physical web as an enabler for that, which is really kind of neat. Here's another example, and this one is actually pretty much already exists, minus the physical web part. Right now, they're not using that as the trigger, but they're still doing it. So it costs about $3 million to outfit an airplane, a 767, with all those seat-back entertainment displays, all those stupid little touch screens that everyone's always banging on. It makes your head go back and forth on the airplane. So what Air Canada Rouge did is they got rid of all those, and they replaced them with a web app. Basically, they turned the airplane into a server for a web app. So you get on the plane, the air stewardess says, if you want to use the entertainment system, just connect to the Wi-Fi, the in-plane Wi-Fi network, and just go to the homepage, and the homepage is supposed to pop up by itself, but this is where actually a beacon would help because it doesn't always pop up by itself. And then you get the entertainment center on your device. It doesn't matter if you're on a phone or a tablet or a laptop computer. And if you don't even have a device, they actually can rent you an iPad for $5. So basically, it means everyone on the plane pretty much can enjoy this without worrying about what device you have. It's progressive enhancement, right? Your base level is everybody gets a web experience, and it's really easy to access, and it works. And then enhancement is that if you actually want to download the app, or if you have the app already, you get extra features. You can watch Game of Thrones and things like that are kind of premium programs. And if you're on Android, you're really lucky because then you can even download the app from the plane because the plane serves the web or the Android app as well. So basically, the plane is a server for content, which is really, really cool, but 90% of it's working through the web. So when you think about the last couple examples, you've got the coffee shop and you have the airplane, I mean, one of the first things that comes to mind is that these apps, right, these things that are sitting at these URLs, they have almost nothing to do with either the Air Canada corporate site or the Starbucks coffee shop site or anything like that. I mean, they're basically single purpose. They're kind of just in time. They're interactions that you will use in that particular time and space. And so it would follow that they could also be more lightweight. And that's, in some ways, that's one of the benefits that always people have talked about with native apps, is they say, oh, native apps are single purpose. You can do better interactions. And it's not because they're native you can do better interactions. A lot of times it's just because they've been single purpose. And the bigger they get, the more they start to, in some ways, resemble a giant website, is the less usable they tend to get. So here you have this scenario, again, where you can really zoom in on what is it the person wants to do. And then you have this extra bit, because this is the physical web, you're going to be walking around with a device a lot of times. Sometimes you might be at home, but still, you'll be probably using it on handheld. So it actually, you kind of pose the question, could it even be mobile only? Because your context here, you kind of know it's mostly going to be mobile. Maybe a dangerous assumption, but it's actually pretty close, I think, in some cases. So instead of delivering this giant multi-purpose website, right, this big container full of stuff that you hope people will want to access, what you could simply do is focus on crafting these really small, carefully curated bundles of experience that tell a really good story about that thing that the person's trying to do. And if you want to be a little bit snarky, you could call it a much better ad, right? And this is what instant articles and all these things are trying to do right now. They're saying the web is really bloated. We're going to give you a really, really small package of really, really nice content, and we'll take away all the bloat. But in some ways you could probably do that. The closer you get to the source of why somebody wants it and what they want to do at that point in time, the quicker you can deliver value. You could call it an ad, or you could call it really good content. But either way, it's probably going to be lightweight, and it might actually be exactly what the person wants. So there's already a little bit of an example of this already starting to happen, minus the physical web, but with QR codes. In China, there's something that's called light apps that have been quite popular. And what they are, here's just some screenshots of them. They're very small, they're a lot of fun, beautifully designed. They often have some video, some audio, they often have animation, SVG, really, really nice stuff. Some of the most creative stuff I've seen in a long time, especially on mobile. And they're single purpose, and they're so tied to just-in-time delivery, because most people will encounter them usually with a QR code or within another app, which I'll show you in just a second. They're so just-in-time mobile that they don't even optimize them for desktop at all, which is not something I would recommend. But in their case, that's it. They don't even, once it gets much wider than this, they kind of don't worry about the experience. So if you put it on a desktop computer, it stretches and it looks really, really horrible. But the whole point is they don't care, because 90% of people will never see it that way. And the main reason this is happening in Asia, in China, but also parts of Asia, parts of emerging economies, is that their way of using the internet is quite a bit focused around either business to consumer or consumer to consumer. All the interactions are happening within either messaging apps, social platforms, even more than they are in Europe and North America. And a lot of those platforms have actually transaction level payments built right in. It's either a virtual wallet or it's a completely virtual currency, little imaginary currencies that you can exchange as units. But the result is that people discover stuff that they like, they have interactions about it, and then they actually transact, they buy stuff. And they either do it entirely within those apps, or sometimes they'll discover it in the real world, scan a QR code, it'll bring them to one of these beautiful little apps, there'll be a call to action, then they go to their social network and they pay for something. And so again, it's just in time, really small, all on mobile. So, here's a question. How long before optimizing for the desktop? And I'm saying optimizing, again, it's a question, and Brad Frost always says there's a difference between support and optimization. So right now we've been trying to kind of do the whole thing, right? But how long before optimizing for the desktop becomes a liability? Or how long before just-in-time, context-based interactions like this are the only reliable way to attract and engage customers or anybody who you want to interest in your stuff? And if you think about it a little bit further, right? So if we're exchanging smaller and smaller bundles of this just-in-time kind of long-tail content with all these little micro interactions, right? This thing that maybe does just one thing, but that's okay, that's all you wanted it to do, right? There's the art exhibit. They had this one beacon on this one thing. All they want you to do is open it up and answer a poll, right? It's fun, it gets you engaged, you can speak to the artist, etc. But that's okay, because that's all they wanted, right? So how long before actually you don't even need to open an app at all? And here I'm saying app, I mean either native or web, right? Because it could just be a notification. It could be a web notification, and it has a little message, a call to action, and then it has like 2 or 3 actions. That's all you need. And you haven't even gone into a website. You're still on your home screen on your phone, basically. So, there's this lovely quote in an article by the publishing industry, and the publishing industry is struggling with this a lot because they're seeing their audience just diminish. And a lot of them are starting to actually say, okay, we just need to distribute our content. And it's challenging for them, but really, what this guy said is websites are an unnecessary vestige of a time before there were much better ways to find things to look at on your computer and your phone. And I think it's really worth thinking about that, right? And all these messaging sites and things, they may be eating websites. I don't think they actually have to eat the web. I think we can get around this and actually let the web be the interaction layer. But I think that the kind of the messaging paradigm and the small bundles of content that do really cool stuff, I think that might stick around. So last bit. This one is fairly short. Scott had a lot of demos here, so I'm not gonna demo this stuff, and in some ways it is mostly stuff that's worth kind of demoing. But the idea is that it's still relatively early days. I think Scott said, I forget what he said the time span was, but anyways, there's some releases coming out soon, and there will be a standardized open web JavaScript Bluetooth API. So what that really means, you've got your beacon, you click on it, you go to that URL, and then your interaction is entirely between that thing that's in front of you. So let's say, I don't know, a thing, I'll point to a thing, I'll say that thing, and it's broadcasting, and I click, and then I'm interacting with the thing, right? So I no longer need the internet as any sort of intermediary. Everything I do is between that thing. And Scott had an example with a little toy, and so again, direct interaction between your phone and the toy, and that's it. That's, you can make the toy do things, you could do it with all sorts of stuff, right? And then the internet connection is optional. So, a few final thoughts. This is a quote from Scott that I've always really liked. He says, each of these examples taken by itself is modestly useful. And I think that's one of the things sometimes you look at these and you think, yeah, well, you can maybe do some of this already, I don't know, right? But taken as a whole, they imply this vast, long tail where almost anything can offer information and utility. You can enhance all sorts of little things in ways that we just couldn't do before. And when you start thinking about random things that all of a sudden have this extra layer of information and utility, and we've already had them, on the web, up there on the web, but now it'll be much closer. I mean, sometimes it'll be direct connections. You'll be directly interacting with things in ways that you couldn't before. And it always makes me think of Don Norman, I'm sure you know the grandfather of interaction design, so to speak. He talks a lot in his books about affordances, and he wrote several books, and he kind of changed his mind about affordances along the way in a few of them. But the idea was the initial definition of an affordance is it's an actionable property between the world and an actor. And so the actor could be a person, an animal, it could be whatever, but things in the world, whether they're man-made or whether they're made by nature, they have affordances, and these affordances are just there. They don't have to be visible, we don't have to know about them. Sometimes we never discover them, but they're still there. And in some ways, the reason we're all in this room today is that human beings, are really, really good at discovering and exploiting affordances and doing really neat stuff with them. But we've never really had to worry about affordances in the way that is coming next, right? When you start to have an object like this, and it's this like wonderful, mysterious new thing, or maybe it's even this old thing, but you don't really know what it can do anymore, right? The opportunity space, what you can do, how you can interact, it's hidden from you because it's not visible until you actually try to seek it out in ways that just didn't happen before. Before, either a thing was smart and it could do something, and it had probably been designed to look like it could do the thing it could do, or maybe it hadn't, but there's going to be all these in-betweens now. And certainly as designers, I think this is going to turn into part of our job, and I don't want to single out designers. I mean, developers, I think, will have a lot to do with this as well. In some ways, we're going to have to work hand in hand even a lot more than we do now. But our job will actually be to kind of mediate and enable not just the discovery of these capabilities, but to kind of, to render them tangible in a way that people can understand what they can do, what they mean, what the opportunities are, and how to kind of link the physical and the virtual, because, it'll be there now, it will be linked. It's just up to us to figure out how to exploit it, how to make it useful and human and wonderful. So to me, this is what I believe the web was truly for, right? Even if maybe we don't quite know it yet, and maybe I'm wrong, but to me, this is really what the web needs to do. So the web, it isn't a page, it's not a platform, it's not a destination, it's not an activity. It's a universal tool. It's probably the universal tool for us to explore and hack and shape and mold the world around us. And I will leave you with a quote from Brendan Dawes that I stole last night because it was so lovely. It's, what if you could bump into data? What if you could hold it in your hand as easily as holding a cup? And in some ways, that's what we're going to be doing, but in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. Thank you very much, and the slides are on SlideShare already.